The Varethian Explorer moved silently through the deep black of space. The ship was large, sleek, and shaped like a silver arrowhead, designed for long exploration missions far from home. Its engines made no sound in the vacuum, only a faint vibration that the crew had grown used to long ago. Outside the thick viewports, the stars hung like frozen sparks in the endless dark. The alien crew of the Varethian Explorer was in a good mood. Their mission had been uneventful, no pirate attacks, no strange signals, no dangerous anomalies. Every scan, every reading, every instrument told the same story. This sector was empty, safe, quiet. The bridge was warm with soft blue light from control panels. The faint hum of machinery filled the air. Crew members spoke in calm, relaxed tones, their voices carrying no tension. On the captain's chair sat Captain Drival, a tall, lean alien with pale green skin and ridged cheekbones. His long fingers tapped lazily on the armrest as he listened to the sensor reports. "Nothing again," said Sensor Officer Lura, glancing at her console. "No ships, no energy signatures, no unusual radiation." Captain Drival gave a slow smile. "Good. We make good time without trouble." On the far side of the bridge, a human stood silently by the main viewport. His name was Lieutenant Mark Rayner, the only human aboard the Varethian Explorer. His uniform was crisp, his short brown hair neat, his posture calm but alert. His eyes were locked on the void outside. Mark had been invited onto the ship as part of an interspecies exchange program. Most of the crew liked him, though they didn't fully understand him. Humans to the Varethians were unpredictable, curious, sometimes reckless. And right now, Mark was doing what humans did best, watching. The alien crew trusted their sensors. To them, if the scanner showed nothing, then nothing was there. But Mark, he trusted his eyes more than any machine. The stars glittered beyond the viewport. A slow swirl of dust drifted across the glass, lit faintly by the ship's external lights. Everything was peaceful. And then he saw it. It was small. Almost nothing. A faint, flickering reflection like a moving shadow across the stars. It was there for only a heartbeat. But Mark's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward slightly, scanning the darkness for movement. The reflection came again. A shimmer so faint it could have been a trick of his mind. But he knew better. He turned from the viewport. "Captain," he said in a low, firm voice, "something's out there." Captain Drival raised an eyebrow ridge. "Sensors register no danger, human." Mark's voice didn't change. "Then the sensors are wrong." Several bridge officers looked at him, puzzled. Sensor Officer Lura gave a small laugh. "Perhaps your eyes are tired, Lieutenant." Mark didn't laugh. He kept staring at the black outside. No, something moved, and it was close. The crew exchanged amused glances. For Varethians, humans sometimes saw patterns where none existed, shadows mistaken for threats. But Mark's tone carried no uncertainty. Captain Drival leaned back in his chair. "Our technology has scanned this sector for hours. There is nothing within 50,000 kilometers." Mark stepped closer to the viewport, his eyes still locked on the dark. "Your technology is looking for the wrong things." Before anyone could reply, a faint tremor ran through the ship's hull. It was so small that most of the crew didn't even notice. But Mark felt it through the soles of his boots. He glanced at the floor, then back outside. His hand rested lightly near the holster at his side. The captain noticed the movement. "Is that weapon necessary, Lieutenant?" Mark's gaze didn't leave the viewport. "Only if I'm right." The bridge fell silent for a moment. The only sound was the soft, steady hum of the ship's engines. In the engineering bay, deep below the bridge, Engineer Toven was running a systems check. The room was quiet except for the steady click of his tools. He glanced up at a panel, frowning slightly. One of the auxiliary pressure sensors had shown a tiny fluctuation, too small to trigger an alarm. He reset it and moved on, unseen, high In the ventilation shaft above him, something shifted in the shadows. Back on the bridge, the crew's relaxed mood had not returned. Mark's words hung in the air, a quiet weight nobody wanted to acknowledge. "Lieutenant," Captain Dreval said slowly, "you believe you saw—" "What? A ship? A creature?" Mark finally turned to face him. "I don't know. But I do know. This," he pointed toward the darkness. "Something out there doesn't want to be seen." Sensor Officer Lura gave an exasperated sigh. "Our instruments are the most advanced in this sector. They detect heat, movement, radiation, energy signatures, gravitational distortions, and they're not detecting this," Mark cut in. His voice was calm, but there was steel under it. The captain frowned. "You suggested it's cloaked?" Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted back to the viewport. "If it is, it's doing a damn good job." Minutes passed. The crew returned to their tasks, though less cheerfully. Mark stayed by the glass, scanning the void. His breathing was slow. His eyes moved carefully over every star, every speck of drifting dust. Then it happened again, a shimmer. A distortion like heat waves rising from pavement, only in the cold emptiness of space. It slid across the star field, then vanished. Mark's voice was sharp. "There! Did you see it?" Several heads turned toward the viewport, but the shimmer was gone. "No," said Lura. Mark stepped back from the glass. "You won't, not unless you're looking exactly when it moves." The captain gave a low growl in his throat. "Enough games. Lura, run a full manual sweep." The sensor officer tapped at her console. "Running sweep." Nothing. Empty space. Mark's jaw tightened. He knew what he saw. And he knew something else. If it was hiding, there was a reason. He leaned toward the captain. "Permission to investigate?" Captain Dreval shook his head. "Not until there is proof." Mark didn't argue. But inside he was certain proof would come soon. Far away, beyond the reach of their lights, something moved. It glided silently, its surface blending perfectly with the darkness, its heat masked, its engines dead. It had been following the Varethian Explorer for hours. And now it was getting closer. The air on the Varethian Explorer felt different. It was not warmer or colder, not heavier or lighter. But to Lieutenant Mark Rayner, it carried a weight, a kind of pressure that only came before trouble. The alien crew, however, still trusted their readings. The ship's scanners had just run a fresh sweep. The results were the same as always, no danger. Captain Dreval had even joked a few minutes earlier that Mark might be seeing ghosts in the stars. Mark wasn't laughing. He stood beside the sensor station, watching Sensor Officer Lura work. Her long, delicate fingers glided over the console. As glowing data streamed across the screen, "Running another scan," she said. "Frequency adjustments, multi-spectrum check, nothing unusual." Mark leaned closer. "Run it again. This time, reduce heat filter sensitivity by 20%. She glanced at him with an amused tilt of her head ridge. "That will pick up debris, dust clouds, even your breath if you stand too close. It will flood the system with false readings." "Do it anyway," Mark said simply. Lura sighed but obeyed. The screen flickered as the scan restarted. Strange little points of light appeared across the holographic display. Most were space dust, harmless. But one point blinked once and vanished. Mark's eyes locked on it. What was that? "Glitch," Lura said immediately. "Static." "Interference," Mark straightened. "Static doesn't move." The bridge fell silent for a moment. Captain Dreval's eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed calm. "Lieutenant, your instincts are unusual, but until we have certainty, we will not deviate from course." Mark didn't argue. Instead, he turned and walked toward the lift that led to the ship's lower decks. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss. The captain watched him go. What is it with humans and their need to chase shadows? He murmured. The lower decks were quiet. Fewer crew worked here, mostly engineers and maintenance staff. The hum of the engines was louder, the air warmer from the reactor heat. Mark moved with slow, deliberate steps. His boots made soft thuds against the metal floor. He passed through a narrow corridor toward the maintenance section. Something caught his attention. A door was open just enough to leave a thin strip of darkness across the floor. He frowned. The door was supposed to be sealed. The section wasn't in use. Pushing it open, Mark stepped inside. The lights flickered on, revealing a storage room filled with crates and spare parts. Everything seemed in place until he saw the wall. 3 deep grooves were scratched into the metal. They were jagged, uneven, and about the length of a human forearm. The edges of the marks curled outward, as if something extremely strong had raked through with sharp claws. Mark knelt and touched the grooves. Cold metal, no heat residue. The cuts were recent. He could feel tiny flakes still loose at the edges. Behind him, a soft sound echoed through the room, a faint metallic tap. Then another, slow, uneven. Mark turned his head slightly, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his side. The sound seemed to come from the ventilation shaft. Above. The tapping stopped. He listened for a long moment. Nothing. Slowly, Mark stepped back into the corridor and sealed the door. He knew what he saw. And he knew those claw marks didn't make themselves. Back on the bridge, Lyra was growing impatient. She'd run 3 more scans, each showing nothing. Captain Drivo was about to dismiss the entire matter when the ship's lighting flickered for exactly 1 second. It was barely enough to notice, but enough to make the captain glance toward the engineering feed. A report came through. Minor power fluctuation detected. No cause found. Drivo rubbed his chin ridge. Minor issues happened in deep space micrometeorite impacts. Small software glitches, but combined with the human's unease, it was starting to gnaw at him. Where is Raynor? He asked. In the lower decks, Lyra replied. He's checking something. In the storage room, Mark was already reporting his find. I'm telling you, he said into his cum. There are claw marks on the wall. Fresh. Something was in here. On the other end, the voice of Engineer Toven replied, Impossible. We haven't had any life forms aboard, except crew since launch, and no one has claws. Mark's tone was sharp. Then explain them. There was silence. Then, maybe old damage? Mark's eyes stayed on the sealed door. Old damage doesn't flake metal. He moved toward the maintenance corridor junction. The air felt wrong. Not bad, not dangerous. Just wrong. He remembered jungle patrols back on Earth. Years ago. In the army, they used to say nature gave warnings before predators attacked. The forest would go quiet. Birds would stop calling. Even the wind would still. Space didn't have birds or wind. But Mark could feel the same kind of stillness now, suddenly. A faint vibration ran through the floor under his boots. Not the steady hum of the engine, something separate. Something walking. He froze, head tilted slightly, listening. 1 step. Then another. Slow. Deliberate. The sound moved above him in the ventilation. Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. It's inside the ship. On the bridge, Captain Drivel heard Mark's voice over the comm. Lieutenant, say again. It's inside, Mark repeated, moving in the vents. The bridge crew exchanged alarmed looks. The captain straightened sharply. Lyra, run internal life scans. She tapped her console. The screen flashed. Scan complete. No unknown life signs detected. Mark's voice came back, cold and certain. Your scans are wrong. In the vent above him, something shifted. The faint scrape of metal against metal. Then, silence again. Mark slowly unholstered his weapon. He didn't call for backup. He didn't shout. He just started moving, following the sound through the narrow maintenance corridor. His steps were silent, measured. His eyes never left the ceiling. He passed another junction, then stopped. The vent cover above him was loose. Before he could react, the lights flickered again, this time for 3 seconds. The hum of the engines dipped. Somewhere far off, a crew member shouted when the lights came back. The vent was still. But the loose panel was now hanging open. Mark raised his weapon, keeping the barrel steady. He could see darkness inside the vent, too dark for the limited ceiling lights to penetrate. He didn't move closer. He just watched. And waited. Then. The faint sound of breathing. Not human. Not Varethian. Low, wet, slow. Mark's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. His voice was calm when he spoke into the com. "Captain, we have a problem." The faint sound of breathing echoed in the narrow ventilation shaft above Lieutenant Mark Rayner. It was not the calm, steady breath of a living crew member. It was low, rough, wet, a sound unlike anything Mark had heard on the ship before. Mark held his weapon steady, eyes scanning the dark space beyond the loose vent cover. His mind raced. Whatever it was hidden well. The ship's sensors had shown nothing. The cameras recorded only empty corridors. Yet this thing was here, moving inside the very veins of the ship. He whispered into his com. "Captain Drival, this is Mark. I'm in the vent near the maintenance corridor. I hear breathing. Something is inside." The response came quickly, but it carried no calm. "Mark, hold position. I'm sending backup." Mark didn't wait. The creature was close. It might slip away if he paused. He carefully climbed onto the maintenance ladder, his boots barely making a sound. The ship's lights flickered again, briefly dimming, as if reacting to some unseen power. Inside the vent, the dark was thick. His flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing the narrow metal walls and the cooling pipes that ran alongside. A wet scraping noise echoed. Mark's eyes widened. He focused the light on a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the beam. He fired a quick burst of plasma shots into the darkness. The creature screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound that bounced off the metal walls. Suddenly, the vent filled with a strange mist that clouded the light and stung Mark's eyes. He coughed, backing away, still firing. The mist cleared, and the creature was gone. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He moved cautiously back to the vent cover. The air felt colder here, charged with an unnatural energy. Back on the bridge, alarms started to sound. The ship's main systems flickered. The screens flashed with warnings, power fluctuations, life support irregularities, sensor errors. Captain Drival gripped the arms of his chair. "What's happening?" Lura's fingers flew over the controls. "Multiple systems are failing, but I can't locate the cause. It's like something is blocking our scans." The captain looked toward the communication panel. "Mark, report." Mark's voice was tense. "Captain, the thing in the vents, it's invisible to sensors. It moves fast, and it's attacking systems. I think it's trying to disable the ship." The captain's face paled. "How many of these things are there?" Mark hesitated. "I don't know, but I suspect more than one." Suddenly, the lights on the bridge went out. The crew gasped in the sudden darkness. Emergency lights bathed the room in red. "Everyone stay calm." Captain Drival shouted. Mark gripped his weapon in the dark. He could hear the faint sounds of movement beyond the walls. Something was creeping closer. In the shadows, a shape flickered, a blur of claws and teeth, vanishing before anyone could see clearly. The ship's ventilation system was its weak point now. The creature, or creatures, used it to move unseen, striking at vital systems. Mark moved through the maintenance corridors, alert for any sign of movement. He stopped by a panel that controlled life support. The system was already flickering. Erratically, he activated the manual override and forced the panel open. Inside, wires were shredded, and small mechanical parts were missing, likely taken by the creature. This thing is tearing the ship apart. Mark muttered. Suddenly, a scraping noise came from behind. Mark spun, weapon raised. A dark shadow leaped at him from the corner. He fired twice. The creature hit the floor, shrieking. Mark rushed forward, shining his light. The creature was about half his size, covered in dark scales that shimmered like oil. Its eyes glowed faintly red in the dim light. It lunged again, faster this time. Mark barely dodged, firing rapidly. The creature screeched, retreating into the darkness. Mark exhaled sharply. This was no ordinary predator. Back on the bridge, the crew scrambled to stabilize the systems. The captain barked orders. Seal off the lower decks. Stop all unnecessary power use. Prepare emergency weapons. Lura's eyes were wide. Weapons are offline, Captain. The creatures are targeting the power grid. Mark's voice crackled. Over the com. I need reinforcements. This is worse than I thought. The captain nodded grimly. All hands to stations. We fight or die here. Mark returned to the vent. He checked every inch carefully. The creatures had left traces small. Scratches, tiny footprints in the dust, faint smells. He realized they had adapted perfectly to the ship's design. Cloaked to sensors, moving silently in vents, striking unpredictably. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Suddenly, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Captain, he said over the com, these creatures, they're not new. They're ancient. Something your people thought extinct. There was silence on the other end. Dreval finally answered, voice low and grim. The Void Predators. Legends say they were wiped out centuries ago. But if they're here, we're in deep trouble. Mark swallowed hard. He had faced dangerous creatures on Earth, but none like this. These hunters were smarter, faster, and invisible to all their technology. The ship was a trap. And the trap was closing. The hours stretched on. Mark and the crew fought desperately to hold the ship together. Each time they disabled one creature, more appeared. The alien crew grew weary, their faces pale under the red emergency lights. Mark stayed focused, using every trick he knew. He mixed human intuition with alien technology, hoping to find a way. To fight the invisible enemy, he rigged small traps with dust and sound sensors to reveal movement. He set traps with high-frequency vibrations to disrupt the creatures. Slowly, the tide turned. One night cycle later, Mark found one creature trapped in a maintenance shaft. It snarled and hissed, unable to escape. Mark took careful aim. End of the line, he whispered. His shot rang out, echoing through the shaft. The creature fell silent. Mark exhaled slowly, relief washing over him, but the fight was far from over. Outside the ship, the stars continued to shine cold and indifferent. The Varethian Explorer drifted in silent darkness. Inside the war against the invisible enemy raged on. Mark knew this was just the beginning. The Varethian Explorer was no longer a peaceful ship. The quiet hum of the engines was drowned by the shouts, footsteps, and alarms that now filled every corridor. The red emergency lights cast long shadows that twisted like ghosts along the walls. Captain Dreval stood rigid on the bridge, his eyes scanning the flickering consoles. Report, he barked to Sensor Officer Lura. We are losing power to the lower decks. Life support is unstable. No visible cause. Mark Rayner's voice crackled over the com, tense and sharp. Captain, the creatures are attacking the engineering bay. I'm moving there now. Mark moved quickly through the ship's twisting corridors, his pistol ready. His mind raced. The invisible enemy was more aggressive now. It was hunting the crew. He passed the junction near the storage rooms. The claw marks he'd seen earlier were now joined by fresh ones, deeper, more violent. A sudden clang echoed behind him. Mark spun around, gun raised. Nothing. He kept moving. The engineering bay was a mess. Panels flickered on and off, sparks flew from exposed wires. Tools and parts lay scattered across the floor, some broken. The air smelled of burning circuits. Mark ducked behind a control console, eyes sharp for movement. "Engineer Toven," he called out. A weak voice answered from the far side of the room. "Here, I'm fine." Mark hurried over. Toven was crouched beside a smashed panel, trying to stabilize the power flow. "We're losing it fast," Toven said. "The creatures are cutting wires, damaging systems." "I can't hold it much longer." Mark nodded. "Hold on. I'll cover you." Suddenly, a terrifying scream cut through the air. Mark froze. Then he saw it. A dark shape moved faster than anything human or Varethian had ever seen. It appeared and disappeared like a shadow. The creature's claws flashed as it lunged at Toven. Mark fired his plasma pistol. The bolts hit the creature, but it seemed only to slow it for a moment. The creature hit Toven hard, knocking him to the floor. Mark rushed forward, pulling the engineer to safety. The creature hissed and growled, circling Mark like a predator sizing up its prey. Mark's mind flashed back to old Earth stories: wolves, lions, hunters in the wild. This was the same dance, but in space and with an invisible enemy. He raised his weapon and fired again, aiming for the creature's glowing red eyes. The creature screeched, staggering back into the shadows. Mark didn't hesitate. He followed, tracking the faint dust that marked the creature's path. Back on the bridge, alarms blared louder. The ship's systems were failing fast. Captain Drevel's face was grim. "Seal the lower decks," he ordered. "Lock down all access points." Lura's fingers flew across the controls. "Doors sealed, Captain, but the creatures are inside." Mark's voice came through, urgent. "Captain, this is worse than I thought. They're not just attacking the ship, they're attacking us." The alien crew was terrified. The peaceful explorers had become prisoners in their own ship. Mark moved like a hunter now, not a guest. His human instincts had taken over. He searched every corner, every vent, every shadow. The creatures were clever, but Mark was smarter. He used dust and powder to reveal invisible tracks. He rigged small noise traps that clicked loudly when triggered. Slowly, the creatures were being forced out of hiding. Suddenly, a heavy crash echoed down the corridor. Mark raced toward the sound. He found a door ripped off its hinges, hanging by a single hinge. Beyond it, a crew member lay unconscious, surrounded by broken equipment. Mark checked the man, quickly breathing, but badly hurt. "Help is coming," Mark whispered, lifting him carefully. The creatures were becoming bolder. They no longer stayed hidden. Mark and the crew prepared for the inevitable. Weapons were distributed. Shields were powered up as best as possible. But the ship was old, and power was low. Every moment was a struggle. As Mark moved toward the next section, his cum crackled. "Mark!" "Report," Captain Drevel demanded, taking heavy fire. "They're fast and silent. We need a plan." "Understood. Hold your position." "Reinforcements are en route." Mark glanced around. There were no reinforcements. Only him and the aliens. He clenched his jaw. "Then we fight." The battle was far from over. Mark's human spirit burned bright in the darkness of space. He was the last line of defense against the invisible enemy, and he would not fail. The Varethian Explorer had become a battlefield. Alarms blared, red emergency lights flickered, and every corridor echoed with the sounds of hurried footsteps, shouted orders, and distant snarls. The invisible enemy had struck hard, but Lieutenant Mark Rayner was far from defeated. His breath was steady, his mind sharp. Every moment he had learned from the fight. The creatures were fast. They moved unseen through vents and shadows, attacking without warning. But Mark had started to understand their patterns, their weaknesses. Mark stood in the central maintenance corridor, surrounded by alien crew members readying weapons: primitive energy rifles, plasma pistols, and hand grenades. The humans and aliens worked side by side now, united by a common enemy. Captain Drevel approached him, voice steady but urgent. Mark, we have to take the fight to them. Waiting is costing us lives. Mark nodded. Agreed. But we need traps. Bait something to draw them out. The captain glanced around. Can your people do that? Mark smiled faintly. We learned a few tricks back on Earth. Mark gathered the crew in the cargo hold, a large room filled with crates, tools, and supplies. He set to work assembling traps. Using powder dust from the supply lockers, he sprinkled it carefully along the corridors and ventilation shafts. The fine dust would catch the creature's footprints, revealing their movements. Next, he rigged noise traps, small devices that clicked loudly when triggered. These would force the creatures out of hiding. Finally, Mark prepared a bait station, an energy source that would emit low-frequency vibrations, attracting the creatures. The crew watched, fascinated by Mark's methods. Humans fought with instinct and cunning, not just weapons. That night, the ship was tense. Every shadow seemed alive. Every sound was a warning. Mark stayed awake, watching the bait station's monitor. Hours passed. Then, the dust showed signs of disturbance, tiny prints leading toward the bait. Suddenly, the noise traps clicked one after another. The creatures were moving, falling into the trap. Mark grabbed his weapon, heart pounding. The first creature appeared, a blur of darkness, eyes glowing red. It moved quickly but cautiously, drawn by the vibrations. Mark fired a burst. The creature shrieked, revealing its scaly form. Other creatures followed, attracted by the noise and movement. The crew opened fire, plasma bolts lighting the corridor. The battle was fierce. Creatures lunged, claws flashing. The crew fired back, struggling to keep their aim steady in the chaos. Mark moved like a shadow, dodging attacks, firing precise shots. One creature managed to grab a crew member, dragging him into the shadows. Mark charged, breaking the creature's hold with a brutal blast. The creatures fought with primal rage, but the crew fought with strategy and unity. Mark's traps worked. The creatures were forced into open spaces where the crew could fight back. Slowly, the tide turned. After hours of fighting, the ship was quiet again. The creatures had been pushed back, some captured, others dead. Mark checked the traps. The dust showed many footprints, proving there were more creatures still on board. Captain Drevel approached, exhausted but hopeful. You've changed this fight, Mark. Mark nodded. This is only the start. Mark's mind raced. He knew the creatures were still hunting. They were clever, patient, but he had given the crew something they lacked before. Hope. And hope was a powerful weapon. The night passed slowly. Outside, the stars shone cold and distant. Inside, the crew prepared for the next battle. Mark stood at the viewport, watching the darkness. The invisible enemy was still out there, but now they would have to face a human who refused to be defeated. The Varethian Explorer drifted silently through space, its hull scarred and battered from the long battle inside. The red emergency lights cast a harsh glow on the tired faces of the crew. Captain Drevel sat heavily in his chair on the bridge, staring at the main console. The screen showed dozens of unknown contacts surrounding the ship, fast moving, silent and deadly. For the first time, the captain was truly afraid. Lieutenant Mark Rayner stood beside him, his face grim but steady. The sensors finally see them, Mark said quietly. They've been hiding in shadows and vents. Now they're coming out. The captain looked at Mark. How many? Too many. Outside the ship, dark shapes moved silently through the void. They were fast, intelligent, and coordinated. The alien crew had never faced anything like this before. But Mark was no stranger to danger. He had seen enemies that could hide in plain sight, that could strike without warning. And he knew one thing: fear was the enemy's best weapon. Captain Drevel turned to his crew. We will not go down without a fight. Mark nodded. We need to act fast. If they surround us, we won't survive long. Mark gathered the crew in the command hall. He spoke with calm confidence. "These creatures are called void predators," he said. "Your people believed they were extinct, but they're here. They're smart and deadly." The crew listened closely. Mark continued. "On Earth, we faced similar enemies. We learned that they always attack the overconfident first. They wait for weakness." He looked around the room. "But we are not weak." Mark laid out a plan. They would use every resource left to them: traps, weapons, and human tactics. The crew prepared for battle. Outside, the dark shapes grew closer. The ship's sensors flickered and then focused. The Varethian Explorer was no longer blind. The crew worked together, their fear replaced by determination. Mark stood at the viewport, watching the stars. The battle was far from over, but now they were ready. Suddenly, the ship shook violently. An explosion rocked the hull. The captain shouted, "All hands, battle stations." Mark gripped his weapon tightly. The invisible enemy was attacking again. The crew fought bravely. Mark moved through the corridors, guiding and protecting. He used every skill he had learned, from human battlefields to alien technology. Slowly, the creatures were driven back. Hours later, the bridge was quiet again. The last of the void predators had been destroyed or captured. Captain Drevel looked at Mark with respect. "You saved us all." Mark shook his head. "We saved each other." The Varethian Explorer limped toward home. The crew was battered but alive, and they had learned something important, that even in the darkest space, hope and courage could shine. Mark stood alone at the viewport once more. The stars stretched endlessly before him. He whispered, "We are not alone, and we never will be." The sensors were silent now, but Mark knew better. There were always threats beyond the edge of sight, and there would always be those ready to face them.